Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Something happened yesterday that converted my very convincing architect voice to some small whispering storyteller voice. But I hope my voice is going to stay with me the whole hour. I am extremely honored to be doing the opening keynote today. It might sound perfunctory, but truly there are so many people here with far more knowledge of and experience in system thinking than I do. So what I feel most comfortable offering here is the experiences I've lived through, as opposed to my ideas and beliefs. Now this picture you see here is AI generated by Midjourney. On the background you see a Danish castle, Kronborg, which is the prototype for the castle Elsinore in Shakespeare's tragedy, Hamlet, to be or not to be. So I feel this picture pretty well captures how I feel about the world we live in today. In particular, the many large companies, big waves, huge challenges, and as software designers and professionals, we have an intrinsic urge to step in and improve things, improve the problem space, improve the solution space. So we try DDD, we try agile, we try DevOps, we try the architecture advice process. We create excitement and results. And we love the energy coming out of workshops like event storming. But to our frustration, many of these improvements would seem temporary and local. We see outcomes of DDD workshops get sucked into some top-down planning cadence and eventually take on a life that is different than what we had imagined as DDD professionals. We see overall organizational resilience dipping as the local team's feedback loops travel through too many layers of distortion and delay to impact decision. We see energetic efforts consistently creating non-results. Sometimes I feel that I'm getting in my own way. So as we see on this picture, it would seem that dramatic conflicting forces are at play. Things are getting better and things are getting worse. So before we get into the content of this talk, let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Xin. I'm an independent consultant based in Copenhagen, Denmark. Most of my consulting clients are large companies with a lot of software, maybe even too much software. So what I'm going to share today is not any leading edge ideas from system thinking, but rather my observations through the system thinking lens of what happened in a large change initiative in a big bank where DDD played a rather central role. So with this transformation story as a backdrop and a connecting thread, I'm going to touch upon three themes: system thinking basics, and system dynamics modeling, and system leverage. And those three themes would be interleaved. As you know, just like everything else in system thinking, these themes the relationships between them are nonlinear. So let's start by setting the scene. Once upon a time, there was a bank in the cold Nordics. No, just kidding. There still is. This bank still exists. It's more than 150 years old. It serves more than 3.5 million personal business, large corporate and institutional customers. And as a workplace, it employs 22,000 people working in 10 different countries, and 4,000 of those are part of the engineering teams and taking care of 4,000 systems. So it's like one person per system, and half of these systems are on mainframe. And so such a organizational context is often referred to as a sociotechnical system, which is basically a nested system setup where a complicated engineered system, for instance software, is embedded within complex social systems, for instance, teams and organizations. And now both types of systems are open systems, constantly exchanging inputs and outputs with their environments. I think over the years, we've developed a fair amount of appreciation for open sociotechnical systems. In particular, sociotechnical architects and leaders are doing a good job reminding ourselves, don't forget to consider the social system around the software you're designing, right? I think we're also becoming more aware of that there are, these two types of systems have different complexity gradients. The engineered systems are more complicated than complex, which is to say that the cause and effect here are knowable through rigorous analysis, and the system behavior is more deterministic and predictable. Complex social systems like teams and organizations, families, and societies, on the other hand, they are complex adaptive systems where cause and effect cannot be known analytically upfront, but they may be knowable in retrospect. All this being said, when the two words social and technical are juxtaposed in the phrase sociotechnical system, it can lead to some unfortunate association, especially in management practices. We hear people talking about using the inverse Conway maneuver to match the team boundaries with domain boundaries. We use team topologies to literally mirror the team structure with system structure and mirror the team's communication API with the system integration API. In our interventions, in what we call transformation efforts, we have a tendency to mechanistically treat social systems as the alter ego of engineered systems. But complex social systems are living systems. They are not as predictable and deterministic, and certainly not as mechanistic as we would sometimes design them to be. So our insights into the behavior of complex social systems have not advanced in step with our understanding of the man-made systems. The next great frontier, as pointed out by Jay Forrester many years ago, is to understand human systems. So most complex social systems exhibit repetitive behavioral patterns over time, and these patterns can be articulated with something called feedback loops. Like this, a feedback loop can be drawn many ways. This is one way to draw it using a causal loop diagram where system variables are connected with causal links which have either a positive or negative polarity. So in this oversimplified example, we have a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop working in conjunction to influence population. The reinforcing loop on the left-hand side says this, that more births today lead to more births in the future. So births reinforce births. A reinforcing loop is usually shorthanded with AR. And in this talk, I would use this blue column graph as a graphic to highlight reinforcing loops. And if this loop were the only one in the system and people did not die, we would see exponential growth in the number of people. Luckily, we have the loop on the right to balance out the effect, a balancing loop. So this loop says that more deaths today lead to more deaths, so lead to less deaths in the future. Why is that? Because more deaths cause the population to fall, which means there will be fewer people around to die later. And so a balancing loop is often marked with a B. And in this talk, I will be using this balancing scale graphic to highlight balancing loops. And now the two lines on some of these causal links are delays, where it takes time for an effect to play out. And so balancing loops and delays are the basic building blocks of system dynamics modeling. And so for many people, the most discomforting truths about systems is that systemic relations are nonlinear. That sounds like a buzzword, but that means that cause and effect are often far apart in time and space. In the spatial dimension, we have a complex web of interconnectedness, not a simple, you add more developers, you get more stuff done kind of linear relationship. And when we try to influence a system variable by introducing an intervention, we need to have a long temporal and spatial travel before we can loop back to the original variable and observe the effect of our intervention. In many ways, the spatial complexity that is, there's this interconnectedness is far less difficult to understand than the temporal complexity, which means that it takes time for an effect to play out, right? I think we human beings are really, really bad at handling delays. For instance, I could have a New Year's resolution. I would start running in the morning or eating a more healthy diet. But if I haven't seen the results after a few days, I would be less motivated to continue and fall back to my old habits. And similarly, we would like to see, short-term effects of our investments in DDD, in DevOps, in whatever else. If the situation hasn't improved, we would tend to lose momentum and start chasing the next shiny idea. And so the eventual consistency time span in a complex social system is just that much larger and longer than that in an engineered system. So for all wicked problems in larger or smaller social systems, the largest leverage point can only be found at a different time and space. As Desmond Tutu once commented about the rising number of misthriving people in the world, we need to stop just pulling people out of the river, give them medication, offer them therapy. Someone needs to go upstream and find out about the root cause, why these people are falling in the first place. So with some systems thinking basics in our tool belt, let's carry on, unfold the transformation story. So the Change Initiative was launched in 2020, centered around a big reorganization, inspired by team topologies, which was published the year before in 2019, and the Spotify model. So on the top right-hand corner, you see teams were regrouped into tribes, squads, chapters, and guilds. And the inverse conway maneuver was used to match the team boundaries with the domain boundaries. And that led to the customer journey tribes, which are streamlined teams, and platform tribes, responsible for standard, repeatable business processes, standardized development practices such as CI/CD, containerization, etc., and domain-driven data. And so the boundaries of domains, tribes, and platforms, and they were designed upfront by the enterprise architects and engineering managers, together with one of the world's largest consulting firms. And so a big part of the transformation design can be explained by these three prospective reinforcing loops. Each of them aims or has the intention of introducing new skills and new practices with the help of enabling teams, which include the DDD and API tribe, where I worked as a DDD evangelist, and the cloud and DevOps tribe in the middle, and focusing on engineering maturity, and then finally a way of working tribe with a lot of agile coaches working with agility and autonomy, that sort of thing. So all three loops, the design, all these three loops aims at impacting the same system variable, which is on the top, which says software delivery speed. At that time, 70% of the engineering capacity was used on keeping the lights on. Systems were tightly coupled. Any sizable change would touch many parts of many systems, requiring a lot of teams to coordinate. And as a consequence, only 25% of the engineering capacity could be used on developing new products, improving customer experiences. All projects were overrun, and software delivery speed was painfully slow. And all this in the backdrop of constantly losing customers to neobanks and fintechs. And so if we expand and zoom in on the loop involving DDD, we would see a transformation logic like this. So starting from the right, the more DDD workshop being facilitated, the better the domain understanding, the better the domain modeling quality, and that would in turn translate to a higher API delivery speed. And because of that, teams' perceived value of DDD would increase, and so would their eagerness to practice more DDD. And as we loop back to the original variable, we have a more lead to more situation. So this is a reinforcing loop. And indeed, this was what happened in the initial months after the initiative launch, despite the chaos after the reorg, and despite the obvious delays implicated in this process. Just to say that not all delays on all the causal links are highlighted for readability, but I guess you have intuition that none of these causal links would happen instantaneously, right? Okay. So, but soon things started to slow down a bit, and a balancing loop kicked in. So on the right-hand side, if we start reading from the middle, the more DDD workshops being facilitated, the higher the demand on us DDD evangelists, because we're getting more popular. But then, the higher the utilization of the DDD enabling capacity, the less availability there will be remaining for the remaining enabling capacity, right? So as we look back, we then have a more lead to less situation, which is a balancing loop. Again, a little bit of technicality. If a loop only includes positive or negative causal links, that's a reinforcing loop, right? More lead to more, less lead to less. But if a loop has multiple pluses and minuses, it can be difficult to tell if we come out positive or negative. A quick way to find out about this mathematically is to count the total number of minuses. So if we have an uneven number of minuses, then we have a balancing loop. Why is that? Because each pair of minuses cancel out each other's effects, right? It's like you inverse a function, and then you inverse the inverse function again, and the last minus would then reverse the direction of the original change. Hope that makes sense. So when you're in the middle of a really high-profile change initiative, and when you have deployed a lot of economic and social capital in making this happen, you just don't want to lose momentum, and you're tempted to intervene. And now the reinforcing loop on the left-hand side is the same loop you would like to keep going. The one on the right is a loop involving a couple of these interventions. So again, starting to read the right-hand side loop from the middle, as the DDD workshop facilitation rate drops, the DDD evangelists were asked by their team lead to facilitate workshops for multiple domains in parallel. And because of this multitasking, the API specification velocity dropped for each domain team. Okay, I need to mention that API specification was one of the DDD deliverables in this transformation initiative, and that the DDD deliverables were the metrics my enabling team was being measured by. The other DDD deliverables included domain models, context maps, and bounded context canvases. So So as that happened, as the velocity of API specification dropped, there were more idle API specialists in my team, which is called DDD and API Enabling Squad. And these API specialists, they were technical people waiting to help the domain teams to design, implement, deploy, and integrate their REST APIs and domain events. So they were going idle, and at that point, that motivated the next iteration. We were again asked by our team lead to time box our domain discovery. And we just executed that time box like clockwork. Out of bad conscience, half of our team were waiting for us to get the stuff done. But as we rushed domain discovery, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, then there was unmodeled domain complexity, which led to more and more premature convergence. And so that really bothered us, DDD evangelists, big time, because we were kind of working harder toward less quality. So soon we started to feel stress and burnout. And half a year after the initiative launch, we lost 1/3 of the DDD part of our enabling team to other tribes and other companies. And when that happened, running more DDD workshops in parallel and with a shorter time box no longer helped. The DDD workshop facilitation rate kept dropping. The wait list for domain teams to be enabled kept getting longer, and the morale of my team kept dipping. So the pattern we have seen in the last 2 slides and in the population example, with a reinforcing loop on the left and a balancing loop on the right to slow things down. That is a system archetype called limit to growth or limit to success. Excuse me. The message from the limit to growth pattern is to be mindful of the real limiting condition or limiting capacity in the system, rather than pushing harder on the reinforcing loop. Because if we do that, we would see what happens on the right-hand side trend graph, that the overall system performance would improve and then fall. Before we continue, just a short recap of the system vocabulary we have encountered so far. Really sorry, it seems my voice is getting lower and lower. I hope I'm not putting you to sleep. Okay, so if we compare the system variables and causal links to nouns and verbs, then the feedback loops and delays are like sentences or individual scenes in a film. And then system archetypes can then be compared to recurring plot lines in multiple films or multiple stories. You can recast the story with different characters and different settings, but the patterns repeat themselves. And so system archetypes are everywhere. They're kind of subtle. When they arise, we often don't see them as much as feel them. Often they produce a sense of déjà vu, a hunch that we have seen this pattern of forces before. Oh, there it goes again. I've seen this before. As for those of us who have been in the same company for an extended period of time, we know these recurring plot lines, intuitively, but usually we don't know how to explain them. And system archetypes provide us this language to convert these implicit hunches to be expressed as explicit patterns. We can use system archetypes diagnostically to explain system behavior, or we can use them prospectively to identify leverage point, or simply to avoid falling into system traps. There is a big catalog, pattern catalog of these system archetypes. I'm going to share examples of two, limit to growth and shifting the burden. In fact, we will only see perhaps less than 10% of all the system diagrams we have drawn as part of the postmortem analysis of our change initiative today. So let's quickly unfold another story in this transformation journey in the DDD space. Now this one has a challenge in the middle, the challenge to deliver DDD-enabled APIs. And now the upper loop tells us, so there are two balancing loops, right? The upper one is a short-term, low-cost solution to this problem by relying on enabling teams, to facilitate workshops or even just to produce those DDD deliverables. The lower loop is a longer-term fundamental solution, but to be, that long-term solution is to build the domain team's own DDD capacity. But to be productive with DDD, it would take a longer delay. And so there's also a third loop in here, the outer one, the outer reinforcing loop, which is a side effect of the upper short-term solution. So because all these domain teams, they have, they had big, huge backlogs and they had very high time pressure. The moment their resource shortage was alleviated by the enabling team, which was, by the way, free of charge for everybody, their perceived need to, to do anything about their own skill gaps just got less. And eventually, that led to less and less motivation to, to really do some long-term improvement of the DDD capacity of the domain teams. So this pattern, as we have seen here, is another system archetype. So this with a problem symptom in the middle, a short-term, low-cost fix, you can call it a symptomatic solution on the top, and a longer-term, longer delay fundamental solution at the bottom is called shifting the burden. And so shifting the burden has many forms. It explains almost all kinds of addictions. And the right-hand side, the trend graph on the right, depicts, the oscillating but gradually escalating buildup of the system, of the symptomatic, of this problem symptom, sorry. Because, the quick fix alleviated the symptom for a while, but the problem would return because you haven't fixed the root cause. So let me just unfold one last story using this format. I give you a last system diagram. This one is slightly more complicated. A good part, actually a good part of the transformation design in that initiative is to improve the productivity and flow of platform teams. And so the way we do that is by way of the reinforcing loop on the left. Starting from the bottom, we use DDD to discover platform boundaries, and that would enable, stable platform APIs, and that would in turn increase the team's independence. So reducing the interaction need between platform teams and consumer teams to something called X as a service rather than the more time-consuming collaboration mode. And so then that would help the platform team to have faster flow of change and a faster delivery of APIs and values. Suffice to say that all platform teams have got a fast flow target as part of their KPI. So measured by how much time and meetings they would need to coordinate with the consumer teams after a major version API has been released to production. On the right-hand side, you see we see the harsh reality. So again, reading this loop from the bottom right, frequent changes from the environment, for instance, regulatory requirements kept changing in banking. So that would increase the need for rethinking the platform boundaries and redesigning the platform APIs. And for that rethink to happen, the platform teams need to talk with multiple consumer teams, right? But that would increase the risk for that fast flow target not being met. And then the pressure for the platform team to find a workaround to somehow resolving the environmental push for a change without changing the platform API interfaces. Because, no interface changes, no need to coordinate, and no danger for that fast flow target. So what we see here is a really good example of local optimization leading to something called negative externality. So negative externality is the consequence of a local activity which affects other parties in the same system without the local party bearing a cost. For instance, pollution is a classic example of negative externality. And so, but an even deeper question is, can flow be pursued as a non-negotiable goal in a complex, nested, sociotechnical system? After all, flow is a engineering metaphor targeting machines, assembly lines. If we carry over the concept indiscriminately to individual parts of a social system, it can be problematic because the same system actors that are responsible for enacting this uninterrupted flow of working software are also responsible for observing and absorbing the changes from the environment. And for that, they need time to pause and reflect, to observe and think, to negotiate and renegotiate common ground with the other system actors. And so, as Donella Meadows once said so beautifully, slowing down growth gives the balancing loop with limits and delays time to function. And the optimal rate in a system is far less than the fastest possible growth. So, what is system thinking then? I think a lot of people think about system thinking as kind of a buzzword. It's very crummy. It's not very evocative, right, in this term. And it's even less self-explanatory than domain-driven design. So, truly what system thinking is to me is to appreciate this symbiotic relationship between the whole and the parts, to see the whole in the parts and the parts in the whole, to honor analytical thinking without being reductionistic, and to practice holistic thinking while allowing the parts the agency to decide on their local affairs and to influence on the global affairs. And so that brings us to the next and final part of this talk, which is systems leverage. So if we want to have good leverage in a system to impact it, we need to understand it first. The trouble is, we are part of that complex social system. We are part of its invisible culture. So how do you ask fish to explain the water they're in? And indeed, in social systems, there is we swim in this vast amount of data and events, and this huge web of constantly changing interconnections that we would never be able to fully see or touch, but structures of which we are unaware hold us prisoner. The only way we will ever be able to grasp a complex human system is through, which is that much larger than our own heads, is through abstract modeling. Without abstract models, we're going nowhere. So we need to use abstractions and models. But hooray, we have seen a few of those models already, right? We have system dynamics modeling. We can use that to understand and impact systems. And we got a good grasp of the reality of the Nordic bank just by looking at a few of those loops, right? So what's the catch? There is a catch. Actually, you haven't seen the reality of what actually happened in the bank. You've seen what's happened, what's in here in my head. And so this is like what Oscar Wilde once said, different people have different perceptions. The optimist sees the donut, the pessimist sees the whole. So even though these system models were synthesized from a lot of different sessions with a lot of different people, I'm still the one doing the documentation, right? I can exclude details and I can customize abstractions and models for the sake of this conference. And so, as an architect, I know too well the one who writes the documentation frames the discussion. So, you're only seeing my view of the world. But you're not even seeing my view of the world. If I ask you to write down, right at this moment, verbatim, what you have heard in the past half an hour, or let's just say the past 5 minutes, you would think, oh, that's ridiculous. I can't do that. But that's exactly what a video camera can do, right? Right there. So the point is, if I then ask you to write down what you have felt and what you have been thinking about what I've said the past 5 minutes, you would have no difficulty at all. So really, the point is that we human beings don't record the world as a video camera. We don't perceive the world, we see. We see the world, we know how to perceive. A woman would see a different world than a man. An engineer would see a different world than a product person. A person with a Chinese background like me would see a different world than a Western person. Our perception is a reflection of our personal history. That is the characteristic of a human system, a living system. That is not the characteristic of a camera or a software system. A camera records, a software system, does what it's designed to do. But a human system doesn't work like that. And so that is a really, really deep point we need to consider. So in order to see how this different things in systems thinking fit together, let's bring in the iceberg model, which is one of the most cited model to explain system thinking and identifying a leverage point. So just like with an iceberg, a lot of what's happening in a social system is hidden from view, right? The iceberg model makes this explicit by including a series of layers that sit beneath the observable layer. So it has 4 layers. The 2 top layers are the more observable, like the tip of the iceberg. So we have those discrete events, right? So like, well, this team this month hasn't delivered any API event. The next layer beneath the event, that is the patterns of behavior or trend over time. You can imagine a API delivery rate over a year. That's trend. Those are the observable ones. So an iceberg is known to have only 10% of its mass above water and 90% is underwater. And likewise, a social system also has this thick hidden layers, which are system structures, those recurring plot lines again, system archetypes live at this layer. And then finally, we have at the bottom of the iceberg, the mental models. We bring forward the reality all through our mental models. Those are those internalized worldviews and our biases and beliefs that help us understand the system and act in it. Okay, so the leverage point. Leverage point is a place in the system where a small change can have a large effect. And it turns out that an event-driven reactive architecture is the least effective way to impact a system. And that is because, something happened, you fix it, a goal is cascaded top-down as input, and that triggers your event handler. As an output, you know what you need to do the next quarter. And so that is what we call a low leverage point, because as the iceberg metaphor illustrates, if we somehow altered the events on the tip of the iceberg, without doing anything about the hidden and the thick parts, the buoyancy of the big ice chunks underneath would then push up to recreate the top. So the lower we go in the iceberg, the higher the leverage point. Then the trouble is, the higher the leverage point, if we want to move the iceberg from the bottom, the harder it is. Because we then are talking about changing the invisible culture again, about the collective habits. Now, Andrew Clay Schaefer, who is a thought leader in the DevOps community, said that a transformation isn't an event. It is a progressive accumulation of habits. But sadly, a lot of transformation efforts in a lot of companies operate at the event level. They are event-driven. They are at the tip of the iceberg. And Peter Singh said, culture for an organization is like personality for a person. Your energy to try to change it would tend to make it stronger. And I have felt it in a very visceral and personal way. So let me just share one last story from this transformation journey of the bank without using any system diagrams. It's time. See, time is running. So this is about my worst event storming workshop. So I've shared this visual on LinkedIn. This is one of the workshop series I've facilitated during this change initiative. I received a lot of compliments. And this is a story I've never shared in public. And this is the part I'm going to break it to you now. So after some initial setting the scene with architecture runway, with wordly mapping, we proceeded to event storming. And then I explained, the goal is to share knowledge, integrate knowledge that might have become siloed, and I put up a really big poster with, we need to see the forest for trees in this exercise. So we started with solo event storming, solo brainstorming, which was the first step, and the next step, as you know, was to merge the timeline, and that turned out to be a complete disaster. There was a war of abstractions, polarized views. The team lead simply refused to merge his solo events into the main event flow. As the clock was ticking, I really struggled to nudge the team to, write down these things as hotspots. Let's not spend extensive time discussing each and every step. Let's rush to the goal, which was one of the heuristic, right? When we called it for a day, we had more, red hotspots than the orange events on the canvas. And so after each of my workshop, I asked people to do a retrospective, and this one was no exception. These two comments stood out. We don't see forest, only trees. The other one, you're too in love with your model. Too much in love with your model. You means me, model means event storming. And the commenter put a smiley there to soften it up, but it was still ouch. So I invited the owner of these two governments for a personal chat. The person who said I was too much in love with event storming said that she was uncomfortable with this rush to the goal heuristic, and she also felt those hotspots were an excuse for skirting around real issues. The other person said, he wasn't clear about the future of this domain, and those, the entry and exit event, which was predetermined by the domain architect, they were not aligned with how the domain teams saw their future themselves. So and he felt that that was really unclear, and that was an elephant in the room no one wanted to touch. So those were, dramatic discoveries for me. Not that I didn't see the conflict, but my sense of mission and responsibility as part of the enabling team sort of locked me up in this tunnel vision of producing these deliverables within the available time. I sort of contributed to reducing the event storming session to a recording device instead of using it as an opportunity to explore polarized views. So this was these two. I'm really appreciative of those two comments. They hurt so much at the time. They made me feel so small and inadequate. But when I finally got up on my 2 feet and dusted myself off, they accelerated my learning in unimaginable ways. I started to feel my way into this art and science of collective reflection. And so, as DDD people, we all know that we perceive the world through our individual filters. And these 3 people can walk out of a meeting saying, "Oh, I'm glad we all agree." But the blue person thought he has agreed to a square. The red person thought he had agreed to a circle, and the yellow person thought definitely it's a triangle. The consensus was all about. So in DDD, we do visual collaborative modeling to make the implicit explicit. So instead of being only in the people's head, they are now on the blackboard so people can talk about it. We know all this. But then what happens then is that people might discover, the best solution is not square plus circle plus triangle, but to integrate, to refine, combine, and integrate the perspectives in different ways. This is so much easier said than done. In most of the sessions I have been to, we either have a situation where the square, the circle, and the triangle were juxtaposed at the end of the meeting, or we have a heated discussion so that either the square means the circle wins or the triangle wins. So what is needed is a different quality of conversation. There are 2 types of conversation to expose diversity. One is discussion, and the other is dialogue. In discussion, it's like a ping pong game, right? We just hit the ball back and forth. And the primary purpose of this game is to win, to get my opinion and my argument accepted by the group. A dialogue is a different mode of communication. Dialogue has a Greek root, dialogos. So dia means through, across. Logos is the word, the meaning. So a dialogue is basically a free flow of meaning where people discover insights that were not attainable individually. So it requires skillful questioning and listening. This is how I see the world. These are the data that back my thinking. I know I don't see the whole picture. How do you see it? Oh, that's a perspective I haven't considered. So it's that type of conversation. So after we have all slept on the disastrous event storming session, I invited the team back into the next workshop. So then I asked them to help me understand what is it about this situation, about me or others, that is making open exchange difficult. Together, we also explored what is the future we dream of for this domain, and what are you personally most passionate about contributing to? So then we did no more event storming. We basically freestyled the next portion of the workshop series. We eventually called them cross-domain sessions and business sessions in the final workshop documentation, because that's also one of the deliverables. And then we proceeded to strategic and DDD and tactical DDD. One last detail about this story. After this freestyled workshops, I gave the team the option to continue or stop. And they all chose to continue doing DDD workshop with me. And of course, I asked them why. And they said, you were trying to convince us that DDD and event storming was a good idea. But now we're just testing ideas together. There was a profound shift in my relationship with the team later. They were more, open about sharing their worries and concerns. And I was more open about things I don't know, including things about DDD. So these days there is a lot of buzz about enabling teams. To enable is to lead, to ask the question, will you follow me? That is a very vulnerable ask. And I think we can all lead from a softer and more powerful place if we can somehow convert our enabling energy from being task-oriented to more skill-oriented and eventually to more relational-oriented. As the quality of our relationship improves, the quality of thinking improves for both the teams being enabled and the enablers. As we engage in these collective reflection, we connect better with the others, we connect better with ourselves, and we connect better with that larger and more emergent purpose and outcome that is so different and so much better than what each of us can bring to the table. To close, I would like to propose a double mission future career for my fellow DDD consultants and DDD enablers when we engage with our internal and external clients. I captured this idea with a simple system archetype with a more output-oriented mission on the top and with a more subtle mission at the bottom. So the upper loop is like the tip of our consulting iceberg, right? These are the gigs, the workshops we're asked to facilitate, to deliver design and architecture, artifacts, et cetera, et cetera. The older I get, the more clear it is to me that the key to real change is never in the intellectual artifacts. The key is always better conversations and a subtle change of relationship. So a subtle change of awareness as well. So this double mission I propose is to help our clients create a supportive, more supportive environments for surfacing those assumptions, for those reflective conversations to happen. So the upper loop is like a top-down, it's driving change top-down through outputs and deliverables, and the lower loop is like growing a generative, adaptive capacity organically. And when we operate the lower loop, we are undercover change agents. So when we are undercover and when we nudge the system icebergs from its deepest level, things stop being black and white. We need to be detaching ourselves from the outcomes, and we need to be less precious about evangelizing what we believe works. As the Danish existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. And now, to close, most of our software today is, in the big system, is created by hundreds and thousands of people working together in technologically sophisticated ways. Our organizations all sit within larger systems like communities, industries, and our planetary ecosystem. Many of these larger systems are in their own crisis. As the world is increasingly more connected by software, I believe that merging software design disciplines like DDD and system thinking gives us the hope that high technological sophistication and high human sophistication can come together and help us create a better future. And that is all. Thank you very much.